Good evening to all the beautiful people tuning in. I'm here to help you sleep. Please support me by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're watching from and at what time, so drop a comment below. Are you ready? Let's start with the first story.
The title of the story: The Vampire of Vicksburg, a blood-soaked legacy. The fog rolled in thick over Vicksburg that night, curling around the bare trees and clinging to the crooked rooftops. It was a town like any other in the Mississippi River Valley, small, quiet, and almost forgotten by the rest of the world. But something dark had woven itself into its fabric, a curse that no one seemed to remember ever invoking. Samuel Weston stepped off the train and into the damp evening air. His eyes squinted against the weight of the fog, and he clutched his coat tighter around him. He was a journalist, a man of reason, and he had heard the rumors, the strange deaths, the whispers of a vampire that had haunted Vicksburg for centuries. The townsfolk avoided talking about it openly, but Weston could see the fear in their eyes. He'd come to write the story, expose the myths for what they were. His first stop was the local inn, a creaky wooden building that seemed to have withstood every storm that had ever passed through. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with a crooked back and silver hair, gave him a wary look when he asked about the town's dark past. "You don't want to know," she muttered, her hands shaking as she handed him a key. "Some stories are better left untold." But Weston pressed her, and with reluctance she spoke of the deaths, the bloodless corpses found each morning, their faces drained of color, their throats torn open. She spoke of a shadowy figure, a man who had once lived in the grandest mansion in town, a man with a terrible curse that had turned him into something more than human. The vampire, she said, had been around for as long as anyone could remember. "You won't find what you're looking for," she warned him, her voice barely a whisper now. "The vampire is real, but it's not just a creature of the night. It's part of this town." Weston had heard enough. He thanked the innkeeper and made his way to the center of town, determined to gather more information. As he passed the dilapidated houses and decaying storefronts, the eerie quiet of the place pressed in on him, an oppressive weight that made his skin crawl. Later that night, after a dinner of stew and stale bread, Weston retired to his room. The window was cracked open, and a chill breeze swept through the room, making the curtains sway like ghostly figures in the dim light. He tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched. The house creaked. The floorboards groaned beneath some unseen weight. And there were whispers, a low, raspy sound that seemed to come from the shadows.
Suddenly, a sharp knock at the door broke through the oppressive silence. Weston hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't expecting anyone, but he reluctantly crossed the room and opened the door. Nothing. He stepped into the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the wooden floors. The air felt colder now, the darkness thick enough to swallow him whole. As he walked toward the staircase, he thought he saw a faint glow at the end of the hall. Just a flicker of light, the candle that shouldn't have been there. Without thinking, Weston followed the light, the whispers growing louder. When he reached the source of the glow, his breath caught in his throat. A figure stood in the center of the room, draped in a long, tattered cloak, his face hidden in shadow. The figure turned slowly, and Weston's stomach twisted in fear. The man's eyes gleamed like two silver coins, but there was something unnatural about them, something ancient. "You seek the truth?" the figure rasped, his voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. Weston nodded, unable to speak. The figure stepped closer, his breath cold against Weston's skin. "You are not the first to come seeking answers, but you will be the last." Suddenly, the room grew darker, and Weston felt an intense pressure in his chest, as if the very air was suffocating him. He tried to move, but his legs refused to obey. The whispers grew louder, swirling in his ears like 1,000 voices, all chanting the same word, Vicksburg. And then, as quickly as it started, everything went silent. The figure was gone. The room was empty. The faint glow of the candle extinguished. Weston collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. His mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic blur. What had just happened? Was it a dream, a hallucination, or was there something far more sinister at work here? The next morning, the townspeople found him standing in the square, staring blankly at the sun as it rose over Vicksburg. He was pale, his face gaunt, and his eyes were empty, like two dark pools that swallowed all light. No one spoke to him, no one asked what had happened, but the innkeeper, the one who had warned him, knew. She saw the emptiness in his eyes and understood Weston had become part of the legacy, the blood-soaked curse that had claimed so many before him. And as the town continued to live its quiet, cursed life, the whispers never stopped. They never stopped because the vampire was still there, in the mist, in the blood, and in the hearts of those who dared to uncover the truth. Vicksburg had claimed another soul, and the curse would never end.
The title of the story:
The Vampire Who Walked Among Us. The humid air of New Orleans wrapped around Claire like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The scent of jasmine and damp earth mingled with the faint tang of salt water from the Mississippi River, filling the streets with a certain romantic decay that only this city could offer. It was a place of history, mystery, and stories so tangled in time that it felt impossible to separate fact from fiction. Claire had always been drawn to the strange. As a young journalist with a passion for unraveling secrets, she had moved to the French Quarter, eager to dive into its mysteries. But she never expected her curiosity to lead her down a path so dark and dangerous. Raoul was the epitome of charm. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and always the center of attention at every event. A successful businessman, owner of several high-end properties in the city, he had earned the admiration of many, and his name was whispered with reverence in the social circles Claire was beginning to infiltrate. Raoul was always there, at parties, galas, and even casual neighborhood gatherings, flashing a perfect smile, his laugh like music, his eyes full of a warmth that disarmed everyone he met. Claire had first encountered him at a charity event held at one of his properties. Raoul's magnetic presence had drawn her in, and their conversation had been so easy, so effortless, that she found herself inexplicably intrigued. There was something unsettling in the way he looked at her, a glimmer of recognition or something ancient flickering in his gaze, but she brushed it off as nothing more than her imagination. Yet, over the next few weeks, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Late at night, after long shifts at the local paper, she would walk through the quarter on her way home, and every so often she would see Raoul lurking in the shadows, watching her. It wasn't just coincidence, she was sure of it. There was an unnerving stillness to his movements, a coldness in his eyes when they locked with hers that made her skin crawl. One evening, as Claire returned to her small apartment after a late shift, she noticed something odd. The sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, echoed behind her on the cobblestone street. She quickened her pace, the sound of heels clicking faster and faster on the uneven pavement. Then she turned a corner, and he was there. Raoul stood at the end of the alleyway, leaning casually against the brick wall, as though he'd been waiting for her. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, reflecting something unnatural, something ancient. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. "Good evening, Claire," he said, his voice smooth, like velvet, but carrying a hidden sharpness. "I've been meaning to talk to you. I think you know something you shouldn't." Claire froze, her pulse quickening. The word sent a shiver through her, the feeling of being watched suddenly becoming the certainty of being prey. What do you mean?" she stammered, trying to sound confident. But her body betrayed her, the chill of fear creeping up her spine. Raoul smiled, but it was cold. "You've been asking questions that aren't meant to be answered." A breath caught in her throat. Claire had been investigating Raoul, trying to uncover the truth behind the mystery that seemed to follow him wherever he went. She had heard whispers, rumors of his strange, ageless appearance, of how he had never seemed to age despite being in the city for over a century. She never expected it to lead her here, face to face with the man she had been so curious about. "Do you know what they say about me, Claire?" he continued, stepping closer, his presence suffocating. "They say I've been here longer than any of them, that I've seen the city change, and yet I remain untouched by time." Fear curled in Claire's stomach, but her journalist instincts kicked in. She had to know more. "You're not human, are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Raoul's smile widened, a slow, predatory grin that sent a wave of cold through her. "What do you think?" Claire's heart pounded in her chest as a heavy silence stretched between them. In the darkness, she could almost hear the faintest sound, a low whisper, like a faraway breath, but it wasn't her own. It was coming from him, something ancient and unnatural, lingering in the shadows. Without warning, Raoul reached out and took her arm, his fingers ice cold against her skin. The pressure of his grip was unbearable, and Claire gasped as her vision blurred. She could hear his heartbeat, or rather, the lack of it. No thumping, no pulse, just the eerie silence of something dead. Raoul's lips parted, revealing elongated canines. The smile vanished, replaced by a hunger, a ravenous thirst that was far from human. I've lived among you for a long time, Claire, but you're too curious, and curiosity, as you'll learn, is dangerous. Her legs trembled beneath her, and she pulled away with every ounce of strength she had. Let me go.
Raoul only laughed, his voice low and dark, resonating in the empty street. But it wasn't just his laughter. There was something else now, a sound too soft to place, like whispering voices in the distance, beckoning her into the darkness. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The night felt colder, the air heavier. Claire's mind raced. She had to escape. She had to warn someone, anyone. But the more she struggled, the more it felt like the walls were closing in, the alleyways stretching endlessly in front of her. With a final surge of panic, Claire broke free, bolting down the alleyway. Her breath came in ragged gasps as her feet pounded against the cobblestones. She could hear Raoul's footsteps behind her, always just a little too far away, like he was toying with her. The whispers were growing louder now, surrounding her. She turned a corner and found herself at the edge of a dead-end street. A chill ran down her spine. The whispering voices had stopped, replaced by the sound of her own heartbeat. She spun around, but Raoul was gone. She was alone, too alone. Claire slumped against the wall, gasping for air, heart racing. Had she imagined it? Was it all just a nightmare? But the icy chill still clung to her skin, the memory of his touch burning through her like frostbite. Then the voices returned, louder now, unmistakable. They were no longer whispers, but soft words. Claire turned, and there, standing in the shadows, was Raoul. His eyes gleamed, filled with amusement. You didn't think you'd escape, did you? But then something unexpected happened. As Claire stared at him, she realized something horrifying. The faces around him, hidden in the darkness, weren't shadows at all. They were real, they were people, and they were staring at her. Who are they? Claire stammered, her breath coming in short gasps. Raoul stepped forward, his gaze softening. The truth, Claire, is that you've been walking among us the whole time. I am not the only one. And then the chilling realization hit her. The vampire she thought she had discovered, the monster she was certain she could expose, was not an isolated creature. He had company. And now Claire was one of them. Her world, already twisted, snapped beyond repair. The hunger within her, the thirst for blood, suddenly began to pulse in her veins. And as the darkness closed in, Claire's final scream was swallowed by the night. The title of the story:
The Silent Vampire of Salem. Salem's air was thick with the scent of rotting leaves, a damp reminder that autumn had long taken root. The streets, once alive with the bustling of a town proud of its colonial history, now felt like empty veins, echoing faint whispers from a time long past. For most, Salem was a quaint, historic town, but for those who knew its darkest secrets, it was a place cursed, where the past never quite let go. Maximilian Ray was a historian drawn to the eerie allure of this town, not for its famed witch trials, but for something far older, a legend. The legend of Eleanor Blackwood, a name whispered among the elders with a shiver, as if speaking it aloud might invite her return. In the late 1600s, during the infamous trials, Eleanor Blackwood had been a young woman accused of witchcraft, and, like so many others, she had been condemned to death. But there was something different about Eleanor, something dark, something vengeful. After her execution, the town thought her story ended. But as the centuries passed, strange occurrences began to unsettle the citizens. Disappearances, mysterious deaths. Each victim had ties to the families who had condemned Eleanor, and each disappearance happened with a chilling silence. No screams, no struggles, just silence. Max had read every account he could find on the Blackwood legend, but there was one thing that always confused him. No one ever saw her. No one knew how she did it. All they had were rumors. Some said she was a ghost. Others believed she had risen as a vampire, an eternal revenant, cursed to hunt the descendants of her accusers. Maximilian, with his sharp skepticism and fascination for the historical, dismissed these notions as superstition. That was, until he arrived in Salem. Max was staying at an old bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town, a building that creaked with every wind gust, as though the house itself were alive, whispering secrets. One evening, as he sat by a crackling fire, an elderly woman approached him, Clara Jennings, the last surviving descendant of one of the original accusers. "You don't believe, do you?" Clara's voice was soft, but carried an edge of weariness. Her hands shook slightly as she set down a glass of cider before him. Max frowned. "Believe what?" "Eleanor Blackwood," she said, her eyes clouded with fear. "She's not just a ghost. She's real. And she's been hunting my family for centuries. She's waiting for the last one of us." Max couldn't hide his skepticism. "There's no evidence to support that. It's a legend, nothing more." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Then you should be careful where you walk tonight, Mr. Ray. You may learn the truth sooner than you think." Her warning, chilling as it was, fell on deaf ears. Max smiled politely, chalking it up to the ramblings of a terrified old woman. But later that night, as he walked through the quiet streets of Salem, the unease that had simmered in the back of his mind began to grow. The town felt wrong. The silence felt oppressive, like a heavy curtain drawn over the world. Even the wind had stilled, and the usual sounds of nocturnal life, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves, were absent. Then he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Footsteps, faint but distinct, as though someone were following him. He spun around, but no one was there. "Probably just the wind," he muttered to himself, though the hairs on his neck stood on end.
The footsteps continued, growing louder now, but still no one appeared. Panic began to claw at his throat. He started to walk faster, his breath quickening. Every creak of the wooden boards beneath his feet seemed louder in the oppressive quiet. He glanced over his shoulder again. Still nothing. But the footsteps persisted, echoing in time with his own.
Max broke into a run, his shoes slapping against the cobblestone. He stumbled as the air grew colder, a biting chill seeping into his bones. He had to find shelter. A flickering light caught his eye. A house, dark but welcoming. He banged on the door, frantic. The door swung open, and there, standing in the threshold, was Clara Jennings. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of dread and sorrow. "She's been waiting for you." Before Max could respond, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that sent him stumbling inside. The house felt colder than the night outside. Shadows clung to the corners like cobwebs. Clara crossed to a dusty bookshelf and pulled out a leather-bound journal. "Take a seat," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to show you something." Max sat, reluctantly, and Clara opened the journal. Her finger traced over the yellowing pages, stopping at a particular entry. "This is where it began," she said softly. The entry was a recounting of the trial of Eleanor Blackwood, written by a judge who had condemned her to death. According to the text, Eleanor had been seen speaking to someone in the shadows just before her execution. The last line of the entry sent a chill down Max's spine. It is said she made a vow that she would return, not as a ghost, but as something darker, something silent, and she would have her vengeance on the bloodline of those who condemned her. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, rattling the windows. The light flickered. Max felt a cold pressure on his chest, as if something was watching him. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was her, Eleanor Blackwood. She stood in the doorway, silent as a tomb, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Max couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her presence was suffocating. She took a step toward him, and the temperature dropped even further. His breath came out in visible puffs, his hands shaking. Clara stepped back, her face pale with fear. "She's here, and she's not here to kill you, Mr. Ray." Max veinsed words. "Then what does she want?" Clara's voice cracked. "She's after something far worse than death. She wants Salem's bloodline, yours included, to end. She wants it to vanish." Max's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. The vampire's silent vengeance wasn't just targeting those who had condemned her. She was erasing the very history of Salem, erasing its bloodlines one by one. The silence in the room grew unbearable, but as Eleanor moved closer, Max finally found his voice. "What do you want from me?" Eleanor's cold gaze locked onto his. Her lips barely parted, and in that instant, Max felt the coldest breath of his life. "You're the last," she whispered, and in a blink, she vanished. The room fell silent, but the weight of her presence remained, suffocating. Clara looked at Max, her face hollow with fear. "You'll never be the same," she whispered. Max stood, his mind racing. Had it really been her, or had his mind been playing tricks? But the truth was undeniable. He had just crossed paths with the silent vampire of Salem, and now he was part of her vengeance. As Max left the house that night, the oppressive silence of Salem pressed in on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was still watching,
waiting for the moment that the last of Salem's bloodlines would vanish, starting with him. And as he stepped into the night, the footsteps began again.